Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get into today's story. Mark Davis was no stranger to pressure. At 23, he was juggling his final year of law school, a part-time job, and an overwhelming mountain of debt left behind by his late father. He had always done his best to carry the weight, but as the days dragged on, it felt like the world was closing in around him. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. Mark Davis speaking, he answered, his voice tense, knowing that every call felt like one step closer to disaster. A composed, authoritative voice came through on the other end. "Mr. Davis, this is Eleanor Brooks. I'd like to meet with you. It's about your financial situation." Mark frowned, confusion creeping into his voice. "I'm sorry, who are you?" "How do you know about I know enough?" she interrupted smoothly. "Let's meet at Brooks Bistro, 7 p.m. It's important." The call ended before Mark could protest. He stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the call settling in. He had no idea who this woman was, but there was something about her calm, authoritative tone that told him she meant business. Mark had tried everything to stay afloat: loans, side gigs, even borrowing money from friends, but nothing seemed to work. And now, here was someone who knew about his struggles, offering a chance to meet. He couldn't say no, even if he had no idea what he was walking into. As the rain poured down outside, Mark walked to the cafe, his jacket doing little to shield him from the cold. He entered the warm, inviting space of the Brooks Bistro and glanced around. It was upscale, the kind of place he had only seen in movies. He found her sitting at a corner table, a striking woman with silver hair, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit. Her presence was commanding, and for a moment, Mark almost felt out of place. "Mark," she greeted, her voice calm yet firm. "Please, sit." Her eyes, sharp and calculating, never left him. He hesitated, then sat across from her, his nerves making him fidget. "Mrs. Brooks, I'm sorry, but I don't understand. What does this meeting have to do with my finances?" She set down her tea, her piercing blue eyes locking onto his. "I know about your debts, the ones your father left behind. I know you're struggling. And I can offer you a solution." Mark raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "A solution? What kind of solution?" He had heard it all before. People promising quick fixes, only to leave him deeper in trouble. "Marry me," Eleanor said, her voice steady and without hesitation. Mark blinked, sure he hadn't heard her correctly. "Excuse me?" "You heard me. Marry me," she repeated, her expression unchanging. "This isn't about romance, it's a business arrangement. I'll pay off your debts, secure your financial future, and in return, you'll be my husband." Mark let out a disbelieving laugh. "You're serious?" he asked, still unsure if she was joking. She leaned forward slightly, her piercing gaze never leaving him. "Exactly. You're young, unattached, and desperate enough to consider this offer. I don't need love, Mark. What I need is someone to share my name, my estate, and my legacy. Think of it as a contract." Mark sat back in his chair, the weight of her words sinking in. A marriage of convenience, no love, no strings attached, just an exchange of assets. It seemed absurd, but the desperation he felt made him seriously consider it. His mother's mounting medical bills, his younger sister's tuition fees, his own inability to keep up with life's demands, it all rushed back to him. Could this woman really help him? He needed anything that would change his situation. "Why me?" Mark asked, his voice low. "You're in need. And you have no one else. I have plenty of suitors, but none of them fit the role. You do. Eleanor's voice remained calm, almost too calm for the seriousness of the offer. This is your chance to solve your problems. But don't take too long to decide. The offer won't stand forever. Mark was speechless for a moment. His mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. He wasn't the kind of man who would jump at a marriage proposal, especially not one like this. But the promise of freedom, of escape from the crushing weight of his debts, was too tempting. I'll think about it, he said quietly, his voice betraying the uncertainty he felt. As he left the bistro that evening, his mind was a whirlwind of questions. Could he really go through with this? Could he marry a stranger for the sake of his family's future? What kind of life would he be signing up for? As he walked through the rain, the world seemed quieter somehow, as if everything had paused for him to make this impossible decision. The next few days were a blur. Mark barely slept, constantly replaying the conversation in his mind. The thought of marrying Eleanor Brooks, a woman he barely knew, was overwhelming. But the more he thought about it, the more the practical side of him took over. Maybe this was the way out he had been waiting for. And so, he found himself back at Brooks' Bistro a few days later, ready to make a decision that would change the course of his life forever. Mark Davis stood outside the Brooks' Bistro, rain lightly falling around him, his heart pounding in his chest. The weight of Eleanor's offer hung heavy in the air. Marry her? It sounded insane. But as he stood there, the cold rain soaking through his jacket, he couldn't ignore the reality of his situation. His debts were piling up, his family's future uncertain, and he was running out of time. He couldn't afford to wait. With a deep breath, he pushed open the door and stepped inside, his shoes clicking against the polished floor. Eleanor was already seated, waiting for him, her demeanor as composed as ever. As soon as she saw him, she nodded, motioning for him to sit across from her. "Mark, I'm glad you came," Eleanor said calmly, her sharp eyes scanning him as he took a seat. There was no hesitation in her voice, no sign that this was anything other than business. It made Mark's unease grow even more, as he realized just how serious she was. He didn't say anything at first, unsure how to respond. The silence between them stretched for a few moments, only the soft hum of the restaurant filling the space. Finally, he cleared his throat and broke the silence. "You really expect me to marry you?" Mark's voice was low, almost a whisper, as if he still couldn't quite believe what he was being asked to do. Eleanor didn't flinch. She simply met his gaze with a steady, unblinking stare, her lips curving into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Yes, I do," she replied. "I know it sounds unconventional, but this could be the answer to all your problems, Mark. Think about it. No more debts. No more struggling to get by, you'll have everything you need." Mark's mind raced. The idea was tempting, no doubt. The weight of his debts and responsibilities was suffocating, and here was a way out, a way to take control of his life again. But there was a catch. Marrying a woman he barely knew, for a business arrangement, with no love involved? That was something he never imagined himself doing. But Eleanor wasn't asking for love. She was asking for a contract, a partnership built on mutual gain. It wasn't personal. It was business. He sat back in his chair, his hands folding together in front of him as he considered her words. Eleanor's life, her wealth, everything she had was at her fingertips. But for Mark, everything felt uncertain. His family, his future, even his own identity, all of it seemed to hang by a thread. "What's in this for you?" he asked, looking up at her, his brow furrowing slightly. "Why me? Why not someone else?" Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing with intent. "You have nothing left to lose. You're desperate. And that's what I need. A man who understands the weight of a contract, who won't question the arrangement." Mark swallowed, the words sinking in. She was right. He was desperate. Desperate to save his family, desperate to escape the suffocating weight of his debts. But was he ready to give up his autonomy, his dignity, just for the chance to breathe again? Was it worth it to marry a stranger for the sake of stability? He couldn't shake the feeling that this was wrong, that something about it didn't sit right with him. But when he thought about his mother's medical bills, the looming debt collectors, his future slipping through his fingers, it was hard to argue with the logic. "You've got your reasons," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I just don't know if I can do it." Eleanor's gaze softened for a brief moment, as if she could sense his hesitation. But her voice remained firm. "You don't have to decide right now, Mark. But I'm giving you the opportunity to change your life. Think about what you'll get in return. You'll never have to worry about money again. Your family will be secure. And you'll have a future, something to build on." Mark looked down at his hands, his fingers tracing the edge of his napkin. It was tempting. The offer was so simple, so clear. And yet, it felt like a trap. He was being asked to give up everything he believed in, everything he had worked for, just for the chance to survive. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Eleanor's eyes never left him. "Nothing, Mark. Just your name. And your agreement." He nodded slowly, his mind still reeling. She was right. This could change everything. But at what cost? He couldn't help but wonder what kind of person he would become if he went through with it. As they sat in silence, the weight of the decision pressing down on him, Mark knew one thing for certain: his life was about to change, whether he was ready for it or not. He was no longer just a law student struggling to make ends meet. He was on the verge of entering a world of power, wealth, and opportunity. And that world came with a price. "I'll do it," Mark said finally, his voice steady. "I'll marry you." Eleanor smiled, a small, satisfied smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Good. We'll begin immediately. The papers will be drawn up, and we'll set the date. This is just the beginning, Mark. And once it's done, there's no turning back." Mark didn't respond. He just sat there, staring at the table in front of him, his heart pounding. He had made his decision. Now, all that was left was to see what would come of it. The next few days were a blur for Mark. After agreeing to Eleanor's offer, he had little time to process everything. His mind kept racing as he signed the marriage contract, a document that would change the course of his life forever. He had gone from a struggling law student to a man about to marry one of the wealthiest women in the city. The irony wasn't lost on him, but he couldn't deny that the offer was tempting, too tempting to refuse. Mark found himself sitting in a luxurious office, across from Eleanor's lawyer. The room was quiet, almost suffocating in its opulence. Everything from the dark wood furniture to the leather-bound books screamed wealth and power. It was a world he'd never known, and now he was about to enter it. He glanced at the papers in front of him, his signature already waiting at the bottom of each page. The deal was set. He was about to be married to a woman who saw him as nothing more than a means to an end, and yet, somehow, that didn't feel entirely wrong. He had his own reasons: his mother's mounting medical bills, his sister's tuition, his own life slowly slipping away in debt. He looked up at the lawyer, who was still going over the details of the contract, and his thoughts wandered to the past few days. After signing the contract, Eleanor had arranged for Mark to stay in one of her properties, a penthouse that overlooked the city. It was surreal, a world of glass and steel, everything pristine and polished. It felt like a dream, like he was living someone else's life. But it also felt like a cage, a gilded one, yes, but a cage nonetheless. That evening, Eleanor had invited him to a formal event, a gala at one of the city's most exclusive venues. Mark had been reluctant to attend at first, feeling out of place in the world of high society. But Eleanor insisted, and he had no choice but to comply. He spent the evening watching her glide through the room, surrounded by business partners, clients, and socialites. She was in her element, her poise and confidence unshaken. Mark, on the other hand, felt like an imposter. He stood by her side, trying his best to blend in, but the world around him felt foreign, overwhelming even. As the night wore on, Mark found himself more and more uncomfortable. He wasn't used to this world, to the sharp suits and expensive wine, to the conversations about stocks, deals, and power moves. He felt out of place in every sense of the word. He excused himself for a moment, stepping out onto the balcony to get some fresh air. The cold night air hit him like a shock, but it was a welcome change from the stifling heat inside the ballroom. Standing there, staring out at the city below, Mark couldn't help but think about the path he had taken. Just a few days ago, he had been at his lowest, desperate for a way out of his financial mess. Now, he was about to marry a woman who had everything he could ever want, but was that all it was? Was this really what he wanted? A marriage of convenience, built on nothing more than mutual gain? Eleanor had made it clear that there would be no emotions involved. She wanted a companion, someone to share her life with, but not someone to love. She didn't need love. She needed someone to fulfill a role, and Mark was that person. As he leaned against the balcony railing, a soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "Mark?" Eleanor's voice was soft, but it carried across the space. She stepped out onto the balcony, her presence immediately filling the air. "You're not enjoying the party?" He turned to face her, offering a small smile. "It's overwhelming," he admitted. She gave him a knowing look. "I understand. This world can be a lot to take in. But you'll get used to it. In time." Mark didn't know if he believed her. How could he ever get used to this? To being someone he wasn't? To playing a part in a marriage that wasn't based on love, but on necessity? "Are you sure this is what you want?" Eleanor asked, her voice quieter now. She was standing close to him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of doubt. Mark hesitated, his gaze drifting to the city below. The lights twinkled in the distance, a stark contrast to the uncertainty he felt inside. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice low. "But I don't have much of a choice." Eleanor didn't say anything for a moment, just watching him. Then, she placed a hand on his arm, her touch surprisingly gentle. "You're not alone in this, Mark," she said softly. "We're in this together. And you'll see, this will change everything for both of us." Mark nodded, though a part of him wasn't entirely convinced. He wanted to believe her, but something about the whole arrangement felt off. Maybe it was the way she spoke, so sure of everything, as if the outcome was already decided. Or maybe it was the nagging feeling in his chest that no matter how much money and power Eleanor had, it would never fill the emptiness that he felt inside. As the night went on, Mark found himself caught between two worlds, the one he had left behind, filled with struggle and uncertainty, and the one he was stepping into, where everything seemed to have already been decided for him. He wasn't sure where he fit in this new life, but he knew one thing: things were about to get a lot more complicated. The next morning, as he woke up in the penthouse, Mark glanced at the contract once more. The decision was made. There was no going back now. The next few days after the gala felt like a blur. Mark had signed the contract, and his life had shifted in ways he couldn't have imagined. He had agreed to marry Eleanor Brooks, a woman he barely knew, for the sake of his family's future, but now, as he stepped into her world, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The penthouse, though stunning, felt hollow, a place he didn't belong. It was as if he were living someone else's life, one that had been planned out for him. Mark had spent the last few days adjusting to his new reality, attending meetings with Eleanor, making appearances at her charity events, and learning the ropes of high society. But every time he looked around, he saw the world of wealth and power that Eleanor had built for herself, a world that seemed so foreign to him. He wasn't sure where he fit in, or if he even wanted to. The initial excitement had faded, replaced by an uneasy feeling in the pit of his stomach. He sat at the breakfast table in the penthouse, staring out at the city below. The view was breathtaking, the skyline stretching out before him like a sea of lights. But it all felt so distant, so far out of reach. He wasn't used to this kind of luxury. He wasn't used to being waited on hand and foot, to having every need met before he even had a chance to ask. It was a life he could never have dreamed of, and yet, it was the life he was now expected to lead. Eleanor entered the room, her presence filling the space, as always. She was impeccably dressed, her gaze sharp as she surveyed the room. She looked every bit the part of the powerful woman she was, and for a moment, Mark felt like an outsider in her world. "Good morning," she said, her voice cool but pleasant. "How did you sleep?" Mark nodded, but the question felt trivial, almost forced. "I slept fine," he said, his voice low, unsure of how to engage with her. He still didn't know what to make of their arrangement, or how he was supposed to fit into her life. Eleanor took a seat across from him, her posture perfect. "I know this is all a lot to take in," she said, her tone softer now. "But you'll get used to it. You just have to trust the process." Mark didn't respond right away. He didn't feel like he could trust the process, not when everything felt so unnatural. He hadn't signed up for this life, and every day he spent in it made him feel more like a pawn in a game he didn't understand. "What happens now?" he asked finally, his voice filled with uncertainty. Eleanor's eyes met his, her expression unreadable. "Now, we live our lives, we attend events, we make appearances, and we go through the motions. It's all part of the deal. You'll play the part of my husband in public, and I'll take care of everything else. This will give you the security you've been looking for. But remember, Mark, this is a business agreement. There's no room for emotions." Mark nodded, though the words didn't sit well with him. A marriage without emotion. It sounded so empty, so cold. But he couldn't afford to be emotional now. He had to remind himself why he had agreed to Thisto give his family a future, to escape the crushing weight of his debt. He wasn't here for love. He was here for survival. Over the next few weeks, Mark continued to play his part, attending more events and spending more time with Eleanor. But as he watched her in action, he couldn't help but notice something he hadn't before: she was lonely. There was a distance in her eyes, a coolness in her demeanor that didn't match the power she projected. It was as if she had built an empire around herself but had no one to share it with. Mark could see it in the way she moved through the world, detached, focused on the next step, but never truly present in the moment. At one of the events, Mark overheard a conversation between Eleanor and one of her business associates. They were talking about the future of her company, about expanding into new markets, and about securing a legacy. But as they spoke, Eleanor's face softened for just a moment, and Mark caught a glimpse of something more vulnerable, something he hadn't seen before. After the event, as they were leaving, Mark couldn't help but ask, "Are you ever happy, Eleanor?" She stopped in her tracks, her eyes flicking to him, surprised by the question. For a moment, she said nothing, and Mark thought maybe she hadn't heard him. Then, finally, she spoke, her voice quiet. "Happiness is a luxury I can't afford." The words hit Mark harder than he expected. He had assumed that Eleanor had everything she could possibly want. But now, seeing her in this moment of vulnerability, he realized how much she had sacrificed for the life she had built. And for the first time, he wondered if he had made the right choice. He couldn't deny the growing tension between them. There were moments when he caught her looking at him in a way that felt almost like longing, but there was no room for that in their arrangement. No room for feelings. This was about business, and business only. Mark didn't know what to make of it all. He was playing his part, and he was doing it well, but somewhere deep down, he couldn't help but wonder if there was more to their connection than either of them were willing to admit. As they walked out into the night, Mark couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, this arrangement wasn't as simple as he had once believed. The days that followed the gala seemed to pass in a haze for Mark. The initial excitement of his new life had begun to fade, replaced by an unsettling silence between him and Eleanor. Their interactions were still mostly formal, with Mark playing the role of her husband at public events, and Eleanor continuing to manage her empire with effortless grace. But as the days turned into weeks, Mark started to notice something he hadn't before. Eleanor, despite her success and wealth, seemed lonely. The cold, detached demeanor she had mastered in public appeared to seep into her private life, and for the first time, Mark began to wonder if she was hiding behind her wealth and power. One evening, after a particularly grueling charity event, Mark found himself walking through the quiet halls of the penthouse, unable to sleep. The weight of the marriage contract, the promise he had made to Eleanor, felt heavier than ever. He had expected this life to be easier, more comfortable, more rewarding, but all he felt was emptiness. The penthouse, the lavish dinners, the expensive clothes, it all felt hollow, like he was a character in a play he hadn't auditioned for. He wandered into the living room, staring out at the city skyline. The lights below seemed to mock him, distant and unattainable. He could feel the tension building between him and Eleanor. They had been married for weeks now, yet their relationship still felt like a transaction. There were no shared moments of intimacy, no conversations that went beyond the superficial. And the most unsettling part was that Mark wasn't sure if it was just the arrangement that kept them apart or if it was something deeper. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned to see Eleanor entering the room, her eyes tired but determined. She had a glass of wine in her hand, and her usual polished exterior seemed to crack for just a moment. She looked like she needed a break from the world she had built around her. "Mark, you're still up?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. He nodded, but didn't say anything at first. The silence between them stretched, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, he turned to face her, his voice low. "Are we just going through the motions?" he asked, the question coming out before he could stop it. "Is this all there is? A business arrangement? No emotions, no connection?" Eleanor's expression softened, but she didn't immediately answer. She walked over to the couch and sat down, taking a sip of her wine. Mark could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the weight of everything she had been carrying for so long. "I told you from the beginning, Mark," she said quietly, her voice betraying a hint of vulnerability. "This was never supposed to be about love. It was supposed to be about security. About getting what we need out of this." She paused, looking out the window, her gaze distant. "I've built an empire. I've achieved everything I've wanted, but I've lost a lot along the way. I don't have room for emotions anymore." Mark watched her, his heart stirring in a way he hadn't expected. He had seen the walls she had built around herself, but hearing her admit it out loud made something inside him ache. He didn't know what it was about her strength, her vulnerability, but for the first time since this all began, he found himself truly understanding her. She wasn't just a businesswoman. She was a woman who had sacrificed her own happiness for success, someone who had buried her own needs under layers of responsibility. He sat down next to her, the distance between them closing just a little. "What if we could have more than just a business arrangement?" he asked softly. "What if we could build something real, even if it's not love right away?" Eleanor looked at him, her eyes searching his face, as if weighing his words. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Maybe," she said quietly. "But we can't pretend that everything will change overnight. We have to stay true to the agreement, Mark. We can't let feelings complicate things." Mark nodded, but the doubt in his mind lingered. He had come into this agreement knowing that it was a means to an end, an escape from his debts and a chance at security for his family. But now, as he sat beside Eleanor, he realized that he wasn't just here for the money. There was something more. He was beginning to care for her, in a way that was impossible to ignore. As the night wore on, they sat in silence, the city lights below casting a soft glow through the window. Mark's thoughts swirled with the realization that his feelings were no longer so easy to compartmentalize. This marriage, which had started as a contract, was starting to feel like something else. Something real. And as Eleanor sat next to him, her hand resting lightly on the arm of the couch, Mark couldn't help but wonder if they were both capable of something more than just surviving. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to build a life together, one that wasn't based on a contract, but on something deeper. But that was a question neither of them was ready to answer. Not yet. Days passed, and Mark found himself stuck in a strange place, caught between two worlds. On one hand, he had the life he never dreamed of, full of luxury and security. He no longer had to worry about his mounting debts, his mother's medical bills, or his sister's education. Everything was taken care of. Eleanor had kept her promise in that sense, but on the other hand, the promise of emotional fulfillment, of connection, had remained elusive. Their marriage, which had started as a business agreement, still felt hollow, like an act in a play, with both of them reading from a script they didn't quite believe in. Mark had kept his distance, doing his best to play his part as Eleanor's husband, but something inside him had shifted. As time went on, he found himself thinking more about her not just as a business partner, but as a person. He noticed little things about her, the way she would pause for just a moment before answering, the way her eyes would momentarily soften when no one was looking. It was clear that she wasn't the cold, emotionless woman she pretended to be, but someone who had been hurt, someone who had built walls around herself for protection. One evening, after a long day of meetings and social events, Mark found himself alone in their private study. He was sitting by the window, staring out at the city lights when Eleanor walked in. She seemed tired, her usual composure slipping for just a moment as she sat down beside him. The silence stretched between them for a few moments, before she spoke softly. "Mark, we need to talk," she said, her voice quiet, yet there was a firmness to it that told him this conversation was inevitable. He turned to face her, his heart skipping a beat. He had been waiting for this moment, the moment when they would have an honest conversation about what they were really doing. "What's on your mind?" he asked, his voice low. She took a deep breath, as if choosing her words carefully. "I've been thinking a lot lately about everything. About us. About this marriage." She paused, her gaze shifting toward the floor before meeting his eyes. "I know it started as a business arrangement, and I've tried to keep it that way, but it's not that simple anymore. I'm not the person I want to be in this marriage, Mark. I thought I could handle it, but I don't want to keep pretending." Mark's chest tightened at her words. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. He had been waiting for this, but now that the words were finally out in the open, he felt a rush of emotions he hadn't been prepared for. "I don't want to pretend either," he admitted quietly. "I came into this for security, for a way out of the mess I was in, but I didn't expect to feel this. I didn't expect to care about you, Eleanor." Eleanor's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. She took a deep breath, as if processing what he had just said. "You care about me?" she asked softly, her voice almost vulnerable. Mark nodded, though he wasn't sure how to explain the depth of his feelings. "I didn't expect it either. But this isn't just a business arrangement anymore, is it?" "It hasn't been for a while." Eleanor's gaze softened, and for the first time, Mark saw a crack in the armor she had built around herself. She reached out, her hand resting gently on his. The simple gesture took him by surprise, but it also felt right. It felt like they were finally acknowledging the truth between them. There was something real here, something beyond the contract. "I didn't think I could ever feel anything like this again," she said softly, her voice shaking slightly. "I've spent so long shutting myself off, hiding behind my success, that I forgot what it felt like to be human, to be seen, to be known. I built this life, but it's never been enough. And now, here you are, and you've made me realize that I've been living in a prison of my own making." Mark squeezed her hand, his own emotions swirling. He had never imagined that he would be the one to break down the walls she had spent years constructing. "Maybe we've both been living in prisons," he said quietly. "But it doesn't have to be that way anymore. We don't have to keep pretending, Eleanor. We can make this real." The silence between them hung heavy, but it was different now. It wasn't uncomfortable, it was a moment of understanding, of shared vulnerability. For the first time since they'd met, they were truly connected, and Mark realized that, despite the circumstances, this marriage could be something more. It could be a partnership, not just in name, but in life. After a few moments, Eleanor spoke again, her voice soft and filled with emotion. "I don't know what the future holds, Mark. I don't know if we can ever be what you want us to be. But I'm willing to try. For the first time in a long time, I want to try." Mark smiled, his heart lifting at her words. "That's all I need, Eleanor. A chance. A chance to build something real together." And with that, For the first time in their marriage, they both understood that what they had was more than just a contract. It was a beginning. And it was up to them to decide where it would go. Mark and Eleanor had decided to try to step beyond the coldness of their agreement and find something more. But as the days passed, something started to shift in their relationship, something neither of them had expected. Their moments together became more than just obligation, they became real. They would have quiet dinners, share conversations about everything and nothing, and for the first time, Mark began to see the woman behind the empire. Eleanor, who had always seemed so strong and in control, was beginning to show sides of herself that were vulnerable, uncertain, and real. However, even as their connection deepened, something still lingered in the air, unspoken and heavy. They were both aware that no matter how close they grew, the truth of their arrangement, the fact that it had started as a business deal, was always there, lurking in the background. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that their growing closeness was an illusion. He kept wondering, was she really falling for him? Or was she just adjusting to their new reality? And for Eleanor, the question was even more complicated. Was she truly starting to care for Mark, or was this just a natural progression from a partnership that had started as a transaction? One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, Mark sat in the living room, nursing a glass of whiskey, trying to shake the nagging thoughts that had kept him up for the last few nights. Eleanor had been more distant lately, her usual warmth replaced by a quiet tension. He could feel the shift, and it unsettled him. As much as they tried to convince themselves that everything was fine, he knew something was off. He glanced at his phone. There was a text message from Eleanor, asking him to meet her in her office. He felt his heart tighten at the thought. He knew this conversation was coming. He had sensed the storm brewing for days. Standing up, he made his way to her office, the weight of the moment heavy on his shoulders. When he arrived, Eleanor was sitting behind her desk, looking out the window, her back to him. The familiar tension was in the air, the kind that always seemed to precede the hard conversations they tried to avoid. As he stepped into the room, she turned, her face soft, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something that Mark couldn't quite place. "Mark," she said quietly, her voice heavy with meaning. "We need to talk." His heart skipped a beat. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice betraying the worry that had been growing inside him. She hesitated, her hands resting lightly on the desk. "I've been thinking a lot about us, about this marriage, this arrangement. Things have changed between us, haven't they?" She looked at him, waiting for him to respond. Mark nodded, though the words stuck in his throat. He wanted to say something, to reassure her, but the truth was, he wasn't sure what to say. He had tried to convince himself that this was just the natural progression of their agreement, that they could be more than just two people bound by a contract. But every time he got too close, the fear of rejection held him back. "I'm not sure what to think anymore," Eleanor continued, her voice steady but filled with uncertainty. "This was supposed to be simple, a business deal. But somewhere along the way, I started feeling things, and I don't know what to do with them." Mark's pulse quickened. He knew exactly what she meant. He had felt it too, the undeniable connection that had started to form between them. But he had pushed it down, convinced himself that it was just the proximity, the necessity of the situation. He hadn't allowed himself to think it was anything more. "Eleanor," Mark began, but she cut him off, raising a hand. "No," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I need to say this. I don't know what I'm feeling, but I can't keep pretending that this isn't complicated. You're not just my husband anymore, Mark. You've become something more. And I don't know if I'm ready for that." The words hung in the air between them. Mark stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. Was this what he had been waiting for? The moment when everything would finally come out into the open? Or was this the moment where everything fell apart? "What are you saying?" Mark whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Eleanor's gaze softened, and for the first time in weeks, she looked vulnerable, uncertain. "I'm saying I'm scared. I'm scared that I'm falling for you, and I don't know if I can trust that. I don't know if I can let myself trust you, or even trust myself." Mark took a step toward her, his heart in his throat. I don't want to hurt you, Eleanor. But I can't keep pretending that I don't care. I've never felt like this before. And I'm willing to take the risk, if you are. For a moment, they just stood there, the weight of their unspoken words filling the room. Eleanor's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she didn't look away. She didn't pull back. Slowly, almost hesitantly, she reached for his hand, her touch soft but deliberate. Maybe we don't have all the answers right now, she said quietly, but maybe that's okay. Maybe we'll figure this out together. If we're both willing to try. Mark nodded, his heart swelling with relief. I'm willing to try, he said, his voice steady with newfound certainty. And in that moment, Mark knew that no matter what came next, they had taken the first step toward something real, something that could no longer be contained within the walls of a contract. The days following their heart-to-heart conversation felt like a turning point for both Mark and Eleanor. They had both made a promise, not just to each other, but to themselves to see where this unexpected connection could go. They didn't have all the answers, but they knew one thing for sure: they were willing to try, willing to let the walls they had both carefully built around their hearts crumble, even if just a little. As the weeks went on, their relationship began to shift. The cold distance that had once existed between them, built by the nature of their marriage, slowly started to fade. They began spending more time together, not as business partners or strangers, but as two people genuinely getting to know one another. Their dinners, once filled with small talk and obligation, became opportunities for real conversation. Mark found himself opening up in ways he hadn't before, sharing pieces of his life that had been buried under the weight of his responsibilities. Eleanor, too, seemed to soften. The sharpness that had defined her early on started to give way to vulnerability, moments when she wasn't just the CEO, but a woman who had carried the burden of her own dreams and disappointments alone. One evening, after a quiet dinner at home, Eleanor suggested they go out for a walk. It was a cool evening, the city lights twinkling in the distance as they strolled through the nearby park. The air felt fresh, and for the first time in a long time, Mark felt at ease, as if the weight of their past conversations had lifted, leaving room for something new to grow between them. As they walked side by side, Eleanor turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "Mark," she began, her voice soft. "I've been thinking a lot about what we talked about. About us. And I realized something. I've been so focused on the idea that I needed to keep everything controlled, that I've been too afraid to actually feel anything. But being with you, I feel like maybe it's okay to not have all the answers right now." Mark looked at her, his heart stirring at the sincerity in her eyes. He could feel it too: the fear of the unknown, the fear of letting themselves be vulnerable, but also the undeniable pull between them. "You're not alone in this," he said quietly. "I'm not asking you to have all the answers. I just want to be here with you, and if that means figuring it out together, then I'm willing to try." She smiled then, the kind of smile that spoke volumes, not just of acceptance but of understanding. "I've spent so long building walls around my life, Mark. I thought that if I kept things in control, I could protect myself from the possibility of failure. But I'm starting to realize that maybe I've been missing out on the most important part." She paused, her gaze searching his face. "The part where we actually live together. And not just as strangers who share a name." Mark felt a weight lift from his chest as he listened to her words. They weren't just talking about the arrangement anymore, they were talking about the possibility of something real, something that went beyond business, beyond the walls of their respective roles. It felt like a breakthrough, like they were both finally seeing each other for who they truly were. As they reached the end of the park, the night air still crisp around them, Mark stopped and turned to face her. "I don't want to pretend anymore, Eleanor. I don't want to hide behind the idea that this is just a business deal. I want to be with you not because of a contract, but because I care about you. And I think, for the first time, I'm starting to see a future with you." There was a long pause, as Eleanor looked at him, her eyes wide with something Mark couldn't quite place. But then she reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "You're right," she said softly. "This isn't just about what we agreed on anymore. It's about what we choose to build now. Together." In that moment, Mark realized that they had crossed a line that separated what was once a mere arrangement and what was now the beginning of something new. They were no longer just two people living under the same roof, fulfilling their contractual obligations. They were partners, in every sense of the word. And for the first time, it felt like they were truly on the same page, ready to face whatever came next. As they stood there, the cool night air surrounding them, Mark knew one thing for certain: they had both taken a leap of faith. And whether or not they had all the answers, they had each other. And that was enough for now. Months passed, and what had started as a marriage of convenience had transformed into something neither Mark nor Eleanor had expected. Their relationship had grown into a partnership, one built on trust, understanding, and, for the first time in both their lives, real connection. Mark had found his place not just in Eleanor's world, but in her heart. And Eleanor, once so closed off, had learned to open herself to the possibility of love, of companionship, in a way she never thought possible. They were no longer two strangers forced into a marriage for survival. They had become friends, partners, and even lovers. They shared moments of joy, laughter, and tenderness that neither had imagined when they first signed their marriage contract. Mark had stopped feeling like an outsider in her world, and Eleanor had begun to trust that the connection they had was real, not just a fleeting emotion but something that could last. One evening, as they sat together in their favorite corner of the city, overlooking the lights that had once seemed so distant, Mark looked at Eleanor, his heart full of gratitude for the journey they had been on together. "You know, when we first started this, I never thought it would turn into something like this," he said, his voice soft, yet sincere. Eleanor turned to him, a small smile playing on her lips. "Neither did I," she admitted. "I thought it would just be a contract. A way out. But I think I've found something more than I ever expected. And I didn't even know I was looking for it." Mark reached over and took her hand in his, squeezing it gently. "I'm glad we found each other, Eleanor. I don't know what the future holds, but I know that whatever comes next, we'll face it together. Not as a contract, but as a team. As partners in every sense of the word." Eleanor's eyes softened, and for a moment, the weight of everything they had been through seemed to lift. "I agree," she whispered. "I've never felt more certain of anything. We've built something here, Mark. Something that's ours. And I wouldn't trade it for anything." Mark smiled, leaning in slightly, as if the words were the most important ones he had ever spoken. "Then let's make it official," he said softly. "Let's make a commitment. Not to a contract, but to each other. To our future. To what we've become." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face, trying to understand the full weight of his words. And then, in that moment, everything seemed to come together. The pieces of their story, once filled with uncertainty and hesitation, now fell into place. "Are you asking me to marry you again?" Eleanor's voice was soft, a playful hint in her words. Mark smiled, a genuine smile, one that spoke of love, growth, and all they had overcome together. "I am," he said. "Because this time, it's real. And I want to spend the rest of my life with you, not because of a contract, but because I've fallen in love with you." For the first time since their marriage began, Eleanor's heart swelled with the truth of his words. She had never imagined that the man she had once seen as a means to an end would become the love of her life. She took a deep breath, her heart full of emotions she had kept buried for so long. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Mark. I'll marry you. Again. And this time, it will be for real." Mark leaned in, capturing her lips in a kiss that sealed their promise, their commitment, and their love. As they pulled away, the city lights around them seemed to shimmer, a perfect reflection of the new life they were building together. In that moment, both Mark and Eleanor knew that they had come a long way from the cold, business-like arrangement that had brought them together. They had created something real, something worth fighting for. And as they looked toward the future, hand in hand, they knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. No contracts, no barriers, just love.